I decided to spend a little bit of time putting together this lightning talk for the very main reason that tech debt is just a concept we often are exposed to. It's a term that has been around since the early 90s. We'll talk a little bit later about where this comes from, but it's really quite funny that considering debt is debt, we often don't really talk back about that debt. So for instance, we often talk about the term in passing, or we use the term when we really have to convince someone that we really, really want to do something, but then we never seem to talk back and say, okay, we paid it back, or it was this bad, or it was worse than what we thought, or not as bad as it was. So we seem to also have be introducing new processes to talk about tech debt or to handle tech debt. In the industry, in engineering, we talk about golden time. Then we have the 20% time. Some companies, for instance, like Spotify in the past, have used chapters as a means of handling their debt. But there still remains this eternal discussion as to whether this debt is really debt and how big of a debt it is. So this was the reason why I chose this topic. I wondered what happened to the analogy. Ward Cunningham started us well off talking about debt, and then it just stopped. So here we go. This is Ward, and this is how Ward, or debt as Ward sees it. So he talks about shipping first-time code is like going into debt. A little debt speeds development so long as it's paid back promptly with a rewrite. Every minute spent on not quite right code counts as interest on that debt. So there's an interesting focus here that Ward gives us on actually the idea of balancing speed of delivery with quality. But it's clear that what he's talking about here is short-term debt. So in financial terms, we would call that a liability as opposed to a long-term debt, because he does mention a rewrite. He talks about promptly with a rewrite. So clearly, Ward is referring to a liability. Martin Fowler then continues and builds further onto this idea, and he also comes up with further taxonomy analysis of how to handle debt or how to talk about debt. He differentiates what is deliberate debt, what is accidental debt, and he gives us yet another way of being able to talk about this debt. But still, me, myself, I'm left working in engineering without more analogies or a better way of talking about handling and what that debt or handling that debt leads us to. So let's see how Warren sees it. So Warren Buffett, I think he's no stranger to any of us here. He is a pretty loaded character that we all know about from the financial industry. And actually, there's a point when he's asked. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you for a sec. Your screen has disappeared. Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's no problem. Don't worry. Just don't want to miss that important bit on the edge. Thank you.
Sure. Sorry. So Warren, he's asked by a friend about where she should be making her next investment. And famously, Warren's answer is, well, hang on. Apparently, you have a bunch of credit cards that are incurring an interest of 18%. To be honest, there's no better investment than actually paying back that credit card. So this is Warren Buffett. And clearly bearing in mind that as per other disciplines across social sciences, even economics has its own flair. So Warren Buffett might be one of those kind of guys that maybe he likes, to invest in a fewer things, but invest fully. Whilst you might have other type of investors that like to diversify even more without actually pinpointing the importance of owning things to the full. But certainly in this case, what Warren is saying is, look, there's no point in having or keeping a debt alive at 18% interest. So what is the key message here? Considering what Ward has said originally in 1992, with what Warren continues to say about, the 18%, that the interest of that debt is you're never going to be able to have a better investment than paying that off. Then I basically put together these two concepts. And actually what we're talking about here is that debt risk is all about the cost of loan, the cost of incurring that debt, coupled with the length of time you want to keep that debt running. So here I forgot to call on Uncle Bob, because I couldn't possibly claim to be working in this industry without quoting Uncle Bob a few dozen times a year. And in all his glory, this is him, leaving no room for misunderstanding. And he says, look, mess is not technical debt. Debt is intentional and it's thought through, and mess is always coming to the cost of companies and teams as a whole. So ultimately, what I'm hearing is that when you're choosing your debt, we're making informed decisions based on our understanding of the cost of that debt and the length of the time that we want our payments, so to speak, to carry on being sent out. So let's stop a moment and think, when was the last time that someone in your team actually invested that time in working out the cost of that debt they're about to incur and planned the length of time that they want to pay that debt back? I would say that often, more often than we'd like, there's these two bits of due diligence are left or sidelined, at least, to the very least. So here we go. This is where I end up. And I wonder, okay, so we did all this talk about debt. We used Warren, we used Ward, we even picked on Uncle Bob. That is always a good thing to do. But I'm left waiting for more from the financial industry, more analogies. And I wonder, what about credit? I have spent over the past few months reading a little bit about credit. How does credit work? And actually try to really extend that analogy that Ward has put through in the early 90s to try and understand whether we can actually use credit more as an analogy as opposed to debt as a way to talk about building healthy tech companies and therefore healthy tech organizations. So let's start with talking about the financial interpretation of credit. And the key question here is, how do people like me and you get access to credit? Especially if we're thinking about that kind of long-term credit or long-term access to funds rather than the payday loan kind of thing that we all know doesn't look great on our credit score and also doesn't really do much of help for people that are trying to invest in a business. And the financial industry really relies on the concept of credit scores. So the credit scores almost represent an indicator that unites an ubiquitous language for risk. Different companies or that we're trying to access or different types of loans that we're trying to ask for will refer to a credit score as their way of understanding whether you are actually would be a good partner to lend money to. So why not do exactly this for the tech world? Why don't we think about this as a way of communicating with partners? So why don't we think about payment history as a way of saying our historical past? How many times in the history have I committed to doing something that actually I did do? And that would count. In this case, for FICO, that's a common indicator for credit scoring, it counts 35% of that decision counts on the fact that I've actually paid or fulfilled my duties in the past. Credit utilization also counts a lot within the FICO credit score. And with credit utilization, I could think that in the tech world, this would mean, do I have a plan of how I want to be using this loan or this time or this investment? Having a plan would definitely help. Then you have the credit age. This also counts. And for us working in engineering, this could be a clear idea of how long we want to ask our lender to invest in us. So how long do we want this loan for? The credit mix, are we diversifying? Are we thinking about risks? Are we thinking that maybe one way of abstracting or rewriting or refactoring a piece of legacy could actually go badly, and therefore we already have a second view of how we could do this? Have we had enough discussions around the different ways we could solve a problem? And then last but not least, the new credit. So the new credit line is quite interesting because it almost highlights how tricky the financial market is, and in the same way how tricky the engineering world is. A lender wants to know that you will come back and keep asking, but not too much, 10% much, so to speak. So they want to know that you're so mature and you know what you're doing and you know who to speak to, and you're really creating a partnership with the other parties involved. So for instance, you could have a partnership with design, with product, with, for instance, marketing or sales. They want to know that you have all these relationships in place and that you're so grounded in these relationships that you're that cool to come back to me and ask me for more credit. And this is exactly what we need to value in engineering. And often we don't. We think of tech debt as a problem that is a tech problem. We don't think of tech debt as an opportunity for creating credit or at least capital. So wrapping up here on the credit, fundamentally, spending properly is actually much better than not spending at all. So using or relying again on one of Warren Buffett's BFFs, Charles Munger, he says, if you take the most powerful freshman text in economics and take a look at it today, it still makes sense. Intelligent people make their decisions based on opportunity cost. So they know what they're trying to achieve with the loan that they're going to go and ask. And this is where we get to growing tech capital. So how do we move the engineering department or the engineering parties involved from a mentality of being a lendee to becoming a lender, where they're actually owning capital? And these are the three things that I would suggest doing first, which is one, identifying your short-term debt, so the liabilities that Ward Cunningham used to talk about, and pay back that now, because nobody wants to buy a company that has really, really high liabilities. Second is identify the areas that you need credit for and express this in terms of opportunity cost. Using opportunity costs is basically the best way to have your partners and other partners outside and within the company understand what it is that you're really trying to unlock with that investment. And third, but not least, stop talking about debt and start talking about capital. The more we talk about debt in engineering, the more we're basically saying we're going to be, we're going to be drowning into debt, and this is the only thing we can ever aspire to. And finally, managing your portfolio as Warren would. So pay your liabilities on time, because that's definitely a good signal you're sending to the markets or to your partners. Plan investment in key areas, as said earlier, is equally to the credit score. If you have a plan of what you want to do with that investment, the market is basically open. The world is your oyster. The market is open for you. Building a diverse asset portfolio means that you need to know that you could do things in different ways, and you know what string to pull or what button to push to activate that diversity. And finally, track the portfolio the same way as you would with your financial assets, and adapt to the market, because things do change. So whilst you thought something was going to go one way, you need to be able to adapt to maybe move or diverge, disinvest to invest somewhere else. And this is it for me.